Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your part of the world. Thank you so much for joining us today for a discussion about the role that wealth taxes should play in making taxes work for women, in advancing gender equality, promoting women's rights, and the well-being of women and girls. My name is Nana Amasarfo. I am a contributing editor with Tax Notes International, and it is my great joy and honor to be here today as the moderator for this session. Now, I briefly want to note that we are streaming in 3 different languages, in English, in Spanish, and in French. And if you look at the bottom of your screen and click more, you should see an interpretation button that you can use to select the best option. Now, globally, wealth inequality is showing few signs of stopping. It is growing in several different dimensions across regions, across countries, and also across gender. Research shows us that poverty disproportionately impacts women. Individual tax burdens around the world, but particularly in the global South, disproportionately impact women. And meanwhile, high net wealth individuals who are predominantly men do not experience the same sorts of tax burdens. So, accordingly, there has been a lot of discussion about how wealth taxation can reduce these inequities, level the tax playing field, and also raise revenue that can fund social programs that meet women's needs. And today we have a very prestigious panel of experts to explain just how that can be done and also discuss the landscape in their own regions and countries. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists today. First, we are very happy to have Chenai Mukumba, and Chenai is the acting executive director for the Tax Justice Network Africa and policy research and advocacy manager. She is also an unequivocal advocate for women in tax in her role as the vice chair of the African Tax Administration Forum's African Women in Tax Network. So Chenai, we are very grateful to have you with us today. And we are also lucky to have with us Verónica Serafini, who is a feminist economist with Latinidad and the Fiscal Justice Network of Latin America and the Caribbean. Verónica has a master's degree in social sciences from Flaxo, Mexico, and a doctorate in economics from UNAM, Mexico. And both of her theses centered on development and gender policies. Verónica, we are very honored to have you with us today. And we are also happy to have with us Jeannie Manipon, who is Senior Program Manager for Development Finance of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. And she is co-convener of the Tax and Gender Working Group of the Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia. And Jeannie has over 20 years of experience in advocacy, research, and campaigning on a wide range of issues, including human rights, gender equality, economic justice, and sustainable development. And prior to joining the APMDD, she worked for international organizations, including UN Women and the Initiatives for International Dialogue. So Jeannie, it is great to have you with us again. And we are also delighted to have with us Sofia Gonzalez, who is a policy fellow with the FACT Coalition, and Sofia, who is a recent graduate from the University of Texas at Austin, is passionate about economic justice and transparency. And she has pursued that interest in her academic and professional work, including research she has conducted on Honduran municipal audits, audit reports to identify economic fraud and kleptocracy, and field experiments that she has also conducted on non-bank commercial service providers globally in the course of researching money laundering and terrorism financing and also corruption. So, Sofia, it is a great pleasure to have you with us. And we are also thrilled to have with us Tove Maria Ryding. And Tove is tax coordinator at Âurea, and she leads the organization's work on tax and transparency and carries out coordination, advocacy, and communications work, as well as research and analysis. And Tove is one of 2 elected representatives for Tax Justice Europe in the coordinating committee of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And Tove, it is more than fantastic to see you again. And last but not least, it is a pleasure to have with us Katrina Miller, who is the Executive Director of Canadians for Tax Fairness. And she has worked for over 20 years to win environmental and social justice improvements at every level of government, collaborating with a wide array of labor, community, and academic experts, and also helping organizations and individuals hone their skills and strategies. So it's a pleasure to have Katrina with us as well. So to all of our esteemed panelists, again, I thank you for your time. I know that we're going to have a very robust discussion, but before we start, I will hand over the floor to Âurea Mouzinho, who is the Policy Advocacy and Campaigns Coordinator for the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and she will provide us some opening remarks.
Thank you, Nana. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you from wherever you might be joining us. It is an honor and a pleasure and a delicious pleasure to be here launching the 7th edition of this Global Days of Action on Tax Justice for Women's Rights. Over these 7 years, this campaign has served to coalesce the energies and efforts of women's rights advocates and activists within the tax justice movement around a simple but very powerful motto: to make taxes work for women. So what does this mean? In this world that has changed in many complex ways since the campaign started for the first time, the COVID-19 pandemic perhaps brought about the most seismic shift, forcing all of us to reckon with the deep-seated inadequacies of the prevailing economic paradigm in the ways it does not protect people, communities, ecosystem from the multiple crises of its own making. Yet, the pandemic added to a context of a rapid acceleration towards multiple collapses, climate disaster, wars, a new wave of debt crisis, with countries in the global south entering or edging vertiginously close to default, or worse yet, forcing governments to halt investments in critical social infrastructure in order to fulfill external debt obligations. Through all of these changes, much has remained the same. The core has held, particularly in whose interests the current economic structures and governance systems work in favor of, who they serve, and at whose expense. Very few situations make this more apparent than the simultaneous explosion of wealth for the ultra-rich at the same time that millions around the world face deteriorating conditions. As per Oxfam's latest report, just since June 2020, while we're in the storm of the pandemic, the richest 1% have captured almost 2/3 of all new wealth. At the same time, poverty has increased for the first time in 25 years. This is outrageous, and more so because it's not an accident. According to the same report, this accumulation of wealth has been accompanied by a global decrease in wealth of top earners. Not only that, countries have increasingly shifted the tax burden towards the poorest with the introduction or expansion of consumption taxes and other types of indirect taxes such as VAT. Across the world, it is women who disproportionately bear the brunt of these tax policy failures through several and intersecting layers of injustice that percolate from the national to the global levels. As of 2020, 252 men alone held as much wealth as 1 billion women and girls in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. While this figure shows the gravity of the wealth ownership gap, we need to understand that the implications are much broader. Basically, every untaxed dollar of the ultra-wealthy, of the ultra-rich, is a lost opportunity for governments, particularly in the global south where they're strapped for resources, to invest in critical underfunded public services that would be essential to address the unequal distribution of unpaid and underpaid care work realized by women. But there's more. Beyond this revenue aspect, taxing wealth is critical for the health of our democracies. It's critical for participation of citizens, and women are part of the citizenry in our societies. And in many ways, it's critical to reducing intersecting gendered and economic inequalities, ensuring that wealth that is created by the many, by workers, and in many ways through women's unpaid and underpaid labor, is not hoarded, but rather redistributed to the collective good, which is one of the essential functions of taxes. The fight to defend women's rights, to bridge the critical gender gaps that persist in our societies, and to build gender transformative, sustainable, feminist, rights-based, and just economies is therefore inseparable from the urgency to tax the rich more progressively. To advance the feminist agenda for gender equality and women's rights, today, throughout the next 2 weeks, but as we've been saying as a tax justice movement, as the economic justice movement, as the women's rights movement, taxing the wealthiest is no longer an option, it is a must. Around this, and this is why in this iteration of the campaign, we are mobilizing around wealth taxes. We are demanding and making a special request, not necessarily request. Let's say we are making a special point to say that making taxes work for women is directly linked to wealth taxations. And we wanted to highlight this in this campaign banner with the double banner that we're using: Women Demand Wealth Taxes Now and Feminists for Wealth Taxes Now. It is my pleasure to invite all of you to join us in the journey of these 2 weeks and more onwards, starting by hearing the interventions from colleagues from the 7 GATJ member organizations on why taxing the wealth is relevant for the work they do in their respective regions. As Nana said and has explained, there are a panel of experts that will speak more on the point than me. So it is my pleasure to pass the baton back to you, Nana, and looking forward to hearing all of the interventions that our colleagues have prepared. Thank you and welcome again.
Âurea, thank you so much for that very powerful intro and sharing those extremely staggering figures with us. I think they highlight precisely why we are here today. When you mentioned that about 252 men hold as much wealth as 1 billion women, as you said, that is not an accident. So now we will move on to our panel. And this year we are doing things a bit differently. We're going to have 2 mini sessions, 2 mini panels, each with 3 speakers. And our speakers will each have 4 minutes to answer an overarching question in their respective segment. Unfortunately, we're not going to have a dedicated Q&A session today, but if any of our listeners have any questions, please do enter them in the Q&A box, and we may share them with the panelists if we have time. Now, with that, we will start with our first segment. And the overarching question is, what are the critical fault lines at the intersection of tax justice and gender justice in your region? And what role can wealth taxation play in advancing both agendas, tax and gender justice? And from what you have seen on the ground, are there any successful cases of wealth taxation in your region? And so now that we have that opening question, I would love to start with Verónica.
Good morning, good afternoon. I am talking in Spanish. Bueno, América Latina es uno de los continentes, en primer lugar, de mayor desigualdad y en segundo lugar, con sistemas tributarios de baja recaudación y con un alto peso de impuestos indirectos. Como ya Âurea señalaba, igual que en otros lugares del mundo. De esto ya impide cualquier posibilidad de reducir las desigualdades de género. Es uno de los primeros obstáculos. Por lo tanto, el impuesto a la riqueza puede ser un instrumento sumamente importante para garantizar justicia tributaria. Sobre todo, teniendo en cuenta que las mujeres latinoamericanas todavía tienen una brecha en sus oportunidades económicas, no solamente con los hombres, sino también con otros grupos de mujeres, por las propias desigualdades de la región. Y porque estamos ante un riesgo muy importante que es el de la deuda, y lo que viene con la deuda, que son la austeridad. En este sentido, el impuesto a la riqueza puede ser, es un instrumento sumamente importante para impulsarlo en la región. Las mujeres latinoamericanas, nosotras todavía no tenemos, por ejemplo, sistemas de cuidado, que es el otro factor muy importante para reducir las desigualdades de género. Sin políticas de cuidado no hay posibilidades de lograr independencia y autonomía económica de las mujeres, de que las mujeres se incorporen de manera igualitaria al mercado laboral. Y nuestros sistemas de seguridad social están diseñados a partir de la entrada al mercado laboral formal. Y la mayoría de las mujeres latinoamericanas trabajan en el sector informal. Y ahí se necesitan políticas para financiar los sistemas de cuidado, los sistemas de jubilación y pensión, porque tenemos que ver los obstáculos en la calidad de vida de las mujeres a lo largo de toda la vida. Las niñas ya empiezan desde el propio sistema educativo a estudiar o a formarse en ocupaciones que terminan siendo peor remuneradas. Se las educa para cuidar, se las educa para el trabajo doméstico, y eso finalmente impacta negativamente en ellas porque terminan ocupadas en aquellas actividades de más baja remuneración, y en algunos casos incluso sin remuneración, que son las mujeres que trabajan en los emprendimientos de los padres o de los maridos, de los esposos. Por eso es que necesitamos impuestos directos, y bueno, el impuesto a la riqueza es uno de ellos. Y un factor muy importante que también tenemos que vencer con políticas públicas es el extractivismo latinoamericano, que ha también impedido que las mujeres, abrir oportunidades para las mujeres. Y es también el origen de una riqueza exacerbada y de una concentración de la riqueza y del poder en un sector totalmente masculinizado y con ingresos sumamente altos. Es decir, desde esta mirada, un impuesto a la riqueza es fundamental por muchas razones, para cambiar el crecimiento económico extractivista que no beneficia a las mujeres, a las oportunidades económicas de las mujeres, para financiar políticas públicas que necesitan las mujeres de cuidado, políticas laborales, de protección social, contra la violencia, tienen muy poco peso los recursos contra la violencia, y para enfrentar un fenómeno que ya venía creciendo antes de la pandemia y que se profundizó con la pandemia, que es la deuda. Y América Latina ya tiene antecedentes sobre los impactos que tiene la deuda en las mujeres con el endeudamiento en los años 80, que generaron las famosas políticas de ajuste estructural, que hoy tienen un nombre que tratan de darle en positivo, que son políticas de austeridad, pero que en realidad significan una redistribución injusta de los costos del endeudamiento. Y bueno, la pandemia nos demostró que muchos se empobrecieron, muchos retrocedimos, inclusive las mujeres, pero un sector se enriqueció. y no puede distribuirse de manera desigual de nuevo los costos de la pandemia, habiendo sectores que se han enriquecido. Por eso es fundamental un impuesto a la riqueza. En América Latina muy pocos países implementan impuestos a las riquezas y todavía están recaudando poco. Necesitamos mucho más trabajo para que este impuesto no solamente se implemente de manera temporal, sino que la idea del impuesto a la riqueza se implemente de manera sustancial, pero también otros impuestos que tienen que ver con la riqueza. Por ejemplo, los impuestos a la tierra, al patrimonio, que también se encuentran entre los más justos del sistema tributario. Gracias, Nano. No sé si me mantuve en el tiempo.
I think you are right on time. Thank you so much, Verónica. You gave us such an illuminating overview of the three main issues that you had mentioned: inequality, low income tax collections, and high rates of indirect taxes that are levied across Latin America, and how those are impacting women. And I think that you also raised an excellent point that more reforms are needed in order to support women in the informal sector. That is key. And as we are seeing, you know, wealth taxation is really one place where that can help fulfill all of those goals. So thank you so much for your intervention. Now, next, I would love to move on to Chenai and get a little more insight on what is happening in the African context.
Thank you, Nana. I just want to make sure that I time myself, because often I tend to overboard. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak. As always, a huge appreciation for GATJ, you know, for sort of hosting this session every single year. It's such an important topic that we don't discuss enough, but the extent to which we can sort of find a way to link, right, tax and gender inequality will go such a long way in promoting gender equality as a whole. So in response to the question that I was asked to speak to, on the African continent, the linkage between tax and gender isn't one that we explore sufficiently. If you do just sort of research, you know, on these issues, what you'll come across is very sort of ad hoc information, very few detailed pieces of work that actually speak to the influence of tax policy on gender equality. So it's something that really requires a lot more attention. We are starting to see movement in that direction. So as you mentioned, Nana, I currently sit on the ATAF Women in Tax Network, because one of the things that the ATAF Women in Tax Network is trying to do is get many more women in positions of leadership in administration, tax administrations, right? The thinking there is that, first of all, let's get more women working on tax policy, but secondly, you're more likely to start to see a trend in more gender-sensitive policies if you have women in decision-making positions. But of course, that's only sort of one way in which we can be looking at how tax and gender link, right? Because the actual policies themselves that administrations put in place are important. So I think with regards to the way in which tax policy and gender is navigating on the continent, very few countries actually have explicit laws that are biased against women, right? There's a few countries, for example, in Morocco, where you do sort of see, you know, sort of legislation where a woman, where the legislation is sort of very clearly biased against women, right? So for example, in Morocco, a woman needs to first show her dependency status, right, before she can get a certain amount of allowance when, you know, when she earns income. And so those exist, but those are sort of far and few between. Largely what we see on the continent is very sort of implicit bias against women. And so, for example, many African countries tax the informal sector, right? And who's majority in the informal sector? On the continent, it's largely women, right? And so there you start to see women have to carry the brunt of the burden when it comes to participation in that sector. Even in sort of personal income tax systems. Here, very few times do we see sort of explicit biases, but often, we're not seeing women, for example, being able to claim allowances for childcare, right? Or any other sort of care work that they do, which really contribute to them being able to participate in the formal economy, right? And these are some of the questions that we think really need to be probed into when we're trying to advocate for not only gender sensitive, but gender transformative policies. Now, with regards to the question around wealth taxes, I mean, this is something that really begs attention on the African continent. Very few African countries employ wealth taxes. And the few that do, it's such a marginal contribution to the overall treasury budget, right? And so this particular call that we have as members of GATJ is one that we fully support. The extent to which we can start to get high net worth individuals to begin to contribute more to resources that we need to fund the key social sectors that women, tend to be the ones that are largely dependent on, the more progressive our taxation systems, right? And it's also really important to do so because of the figures that, Nana, you mentioned, as well as Âurea, right? When you look at the rate at which wealthy people are earning money, income, etc. Those resources are not earned on a whim, right? They live within an economy that's creating an environment for them to be able to generate that revenue. So it only makes sense that they, as a result of how much they're benefiting from a society, are contributing to the extent that they're benefiting to an economy. So really the push for wealth taxes is one that we support, and we're increasingly starting to see African countries move in this direction. Kenya is a country that recently indicated that they were starting to consider this. South Africa is one. And so we're starting to see more policymakers recognize that this is an important tool for addressing inequality as a whole. But of course, specific to this conversation, really could be a tool that helps us address the broader gender inequality question that we face. Thanks so much, Nana.
Thank you, Chenai. I especially loved your statement that we need policies that are not just gender sensitive, but also gender transformative. And I think that is so, so important in light of what you had mentioned, given the fact that you are finding that taxes on the ground are not explicitly biased against women, but they are implicitly biased. So it's not just enough to make sure that our tax systems do not impact women disproportionately, but we also need to make sure that they advance women's equality and help lessen that gap that has been created over, decades. So thank you so much for that. Now to close out this segment, I will move on to Jeannie and hand her the floor. And Jeannie, looking forward to your remarks on what you are seeing across Asia.
Okay, yeah. Actually,
there we go. We can hear you now.
Thank you. That Chenai and Verónica have been talking about in Africa and Latin America are actually very similar to what's happening in Asia. We all know that women bear a disproportionate share of the negative impacts of faulty tax systems. Our speakers have already said that, especially tax systems that are overly reliant on indirect taxes like the VAT or the GST, as it's called in other countries, or other regressive tax policies. This means that because of the consumption taxes levied on many essential products, a mother who is working as a street vendor to feed 2 or 3 children could actually end up spending a much bigger share of her meager income to pay indirect taxes than what a billionaire who owns a chain of mega shopping malls would be paying. So imagine a tax system that relies heavily on the revenues collected daily from millions of working women and men in the form of consumption taxes, plus income taxes, many of which in our countries are usually in the form of withholding tax. So even before you receive your salary, your income, get it in your hands, the tax is already collected. So for those, especially for those in, at least for the formal economy, and now the informal economy are being looked at, not to pay a bigger share to how do they collect taxes in the informal economy. And as Chenai already pointed out, it's the same in Asia. Women are overly represented in the informal economy. And imagine how, on the other hand, billionaires are actually getting away with hoarding wealth, including through unscrupulous practices to hide wealth in tax havens. So this situation is simply unjust and unsustainable and unbearable for many women. And yet, as governments face the challenge of falling or inadequate revenues, the first to go in budget cuts are the public spending for essential and critical social services that are vital to many women's survival. The trend in many countries in Asia is really disturbing. Governments continue to rely more on indirect taxes that may be efficient to collect, but in the end are burdensome for women and marginalized communities. In Pakistan, Philippines, Indonesia, India, and many other places, access to food and water have been severely compromised, especially in the last recent months, not only because of the onslaught of climate change impacts on basic food and water systems, not only because of the pandemic's direct and indirect effects in the last 2 years, but also because of the accumulated impacts of long-standing flawed economic policies. No? And that also includes unfair and flawed tax policies that have caused leaks in our economies and that have simply eroded people's capacities to survive, to enjoy their rights, and live a life of dignity. Asia hosts some of the world's fastest growing economies, but inequalities are also rising just as fast. Tax systems, many of which are colonial legacies, actually have been designed to protect the interests and agendas of the elite and of corporations. And by elite, I mean both political and business elites. Our region is characterized by low tax to GDP ratio, well-entrenched tax incentive regimes that actually favor multinational corporations, especially extractive industries. Fierce tax competition is also characteristic of this region, which means that to attract investors, corporate taxation has been on a steep decline. And gender biases, like in other regions, direct and indirect, are also reflected in tax systems in a few countries in the region. A lot of wealth, staggering, dazzling wealth is being created in this region, but where is it going and who is benefiting from it? The call for a wealth tax to fairly and sharply tax wealth, not just income, no? It should include non-financial assets, is really long overdue. It's a matter of justice as well as necessity, as Âurea already pointed out, because this wealth tax will really harness the redistributive potential of taxation. A wealth tax can work for women's rights in many ways. It can raise revenues for increased funding of public services, primary healthcare and reproductive healthcare facilities, very much badly needed in the region, provision of water, access to quality education, and so on. It can also correct the predominantly regressive character of our tax systems as a fundamental matter of justice, of tax justice, and reduce, if not erase, the need to impose and collect indirect taxes that are burdensome for women and marginalized communities. A wealth tax in the long run also strengthens the abilities of governments to address gaps in domestic resource mobilization, which in turn can increase government's capacities to deliver on gender equality commitments and human rights obligations, and to finance urgent climate action needed to arrest the climate crisis that is also impacting women disproportionately. We don't have a long history of wealth taxes in the Philippines. There's been a bill that has been filed, but we know that it's going to be a fierce fight, precisely because it will really touch on the nerve and the interests of our elites. But it is really a fight worth fighting for. Thank you.
Jeannie, thank you so much for your intervention and for reminding us that as we are trying to rebuild our tax systems, that it is important not to just look at wealth taxes. I mean, they are the predominant thing to look at, but also we need to review our tax competition and also the tax incentives that are being offered to multinationals and make sure that the system is being revised in which to eliminate some of those distortionary practices. So very, very grateful for your remarks. And now just to close out this segment, I would love for Verónica and Jeannie to provide us each with quick 2-minute closing remarks, again, emphasizing what is important within your regions, but then also if you have any advice or information to share on how today's participants can mobilize themselves and organize themselves to help support wealth taxation as a tool for gender equality, that would be extremely helpful to know. Unfortunately, Chenai had to drop off, so she will not be joining us in these final remarks. So with that, if we could start with you, please, Verónica.
Bueno, yo creo que en primer lugar es importante trabajar más en nuestra región con nuestras propias organizaciones, generando ciudadanía económica y mostrando mucho más las desigualdades, porque conocemos mucho las desigualdades por el lado del gasto, pero no por el lado del ingreso, de los ingresos tributarios. Y eso es importante mostrar. Y para eso necesitamos incidir mucho más en que los gobiernos tengan datos desagregados por sexo y tengan datos desagregados también por niveles de ingreso para saber quiénes son los que pagan impuestos y sobre quiénes recae. Todo esto que estamos diciendo debiéramos poder tener, por ejemplo, datos anuales. Mientras que hoy, así como tenemos gasto en salud, inversión en educación, necesitamos tener estos datos actualizados para mejorar nuestra incidencia. Porque todo lo que hoy sabemos, lo sabemos con muchísimo esfuerzo, porque mucha de esta información es opaca. Inclusive la cuantificación de flujos ilícitos, tenemos todavía del gasto tributario, de los privilegios tributarios, porque muchas veces tenemos impuestos directos, pero que están totalmente perforados por exoneraciones o deducciones tributarias. Y que por naturaleza son injustas porque terminan beneficiando más a los sectores más ricos, inclusive por los costos de deducir. ¿Qué mujer que paga impuestos va a tener el tiempo y el dinero de pagarle a un profesional para que haga todos los trámites para deducir unos pocos impuestos? Termina pagando, mientras que los sectores de mayores recursos sí tienen. Por el otro lado, tenemos que las transferencias monetarias, por ejemplo, dirigidas a mujeres pobres, sí sabemos todo. Sabemos a quiénes van, quiénes reciben, hasta le controlamos qué hacen con esos recursos. Ahí el sistema tributario no solamente es injusto en términos de cómo cobra y qué cobra, cómo recauda, sino también en la información que provee. Y muchas veces esa información, al no estar disponible, te estigmatiza o tenemos una idea sesgada. Y bueno, eso ya ha pasado en América Latina, en algunos países en que, por ejemplo, se trató de impulsar el impuesto a la riqueza o el impuesto a la herencia, y resulta que la población en general creyó que iba a terminar pagando esos impuestos y se negó a apoyar. Y hay que mostrar eso. Entonces, no solamente es importante impulsar un cambio en el sistema tributario, sino también apoyar o impulsar una mayor transparencia del sistema tributario, porque todo lo que se refiere a la riqueza es opaca hoy en los sistemas de información. Creo que esos esos dos objetivos tendrían que estar en todas nuestras organizaciones de manera a, por el lado de los ingresos y de los presupuestos y de una política fiscal feminista y transformadora, podamos trabajar y cambiar.
Verónica, thank you so much, especially for your points regarding the need for disaggregated data by gender. I know that this is a problem that governments have around the world, that they are not simply tracking how taxpayers are paying tax and what their burdens are according to gender. So that is a very, very crucial point that you made. Thank you for that. Now I will pass the floor on to Jeannie for her closing remarks.
First of all, many women, especially in the grassroots, tend to shun away from the tax issues. They think it's too technical, but once they start getting into it and raising the questions and appreciating how the tax system, the big role that the tax system actually plays in the running of the global economy, and who gets, why, how people, certain people, the elite, become rich, and why there's no money for public services, then they become very passionate about it. So I think for those of us who are working with grassroots groups, let's really be patient and really explain very well how relevant it is to the day-to-day life, not from the bar of soap they use in the morning when they wash their face to the food they serve. And that they will really get, they can be very passionate about it. The second thing is the important role that journalists play in exposing. So let's try to really sensitize media to get them interested in this. They have an important, we have seen how the Pandora Papers, for example, how this expose has really helped us in getting some of the information and getting attention to the issues that we work on. Thirdly, the role of lawmakers, parliamentarians. Of course, the tax reform really necessitates legislative action. Finally, we really need to build a deep and broad front to fight for a wealth tax, because it will not be easy. We need the support of champions in government, legislators, but we also need to show our muscle, our movement, that we are ready to fight for it. So building that front of movements with other economic justice actors, but also champions in international organizations and among decision makers, that is something that we should really work on together. Thank you.
Jeannie, thank you so much for your remarks. Definitely, you made an important point that tax is not a topic that women should shy away from in the least. It is such a vibrant and dynamic area to explore. And as you had mentioned, if we do not show our muscle, we cannot get policymakers to take us seriously. Now, moving on to the second part of today's panel discussion, one of the key challenges of taxing wealth involves the wall of secrecy around asset ownership at a global scale, and also the ways in which regulatory regimes around the world have not been able to catch up and break through this financial secrecy. But even so, we have seen some important developments from the United States and from Europe. And so I would love for our second group of panelists, Tove and Sofia, to discuss these advances in their regions and countries and how they represent progress for the tax justice agenda and women's rights, and the risks that they also may pose. Now, before we start, I just want to briefly note that unfortunately, Katrina cannot join us today. So we will have Tove and Sofia on the second part. So with that, if Tove, you are ready, I will hand over the floor to you.
Sure. I'm ready, and warm thanks, Nana, and warm thanks to all the fantastic other panelists. It's a very enjoyable debate. And yes, a wealth tax, a major challenge that we have in terms of wealth taxes is that we still have tax havens where wealthy individuals and wealthy corporations can hide their wealth using either illegal tax evasion or actually fully legal, but often very secret tax avoidance mechanisms. So wealth taxes at the national level is absolutely crucial. And there's so much that can already be done in terms of taxing wealth better at the national level. But at some point, we run into the wall. The tax systems cannot only be solved from the national level because wealth is getting hidden internationally in tax havens. Good news from Europe. The best news from Europe is that the European countries, and in fact, all of the OECD countries, stopped blocking progress towards truly global tax cooperation. We have heard developing countries at the United Nations literally for over a decade call for a truly global negotiation on how to solve the international problems related to taxation. They have called for a negotiation at the United Nations where all countries can participate as equals. And for equally long time, we have seen the OECD countries block this proposal and insist on having global tax standards be set at the OECD, despite the fact that countries cannot negotiate on an equal footing at the OECD. And so the best news we have from Europe is that in November 2022, suddenly we saw a major shift. And after the Africa group had shown a lot of leadership and tabled a resolution at the UN General Assembly to say that we need a UN tax negotiation, suddenly we saw a major shift, and we did not only see all the European countries vote in favor of the resolution, but in fact, we also had all the other countries, including the United States, Canada, and everybody vote in favor. So it was adopted by consensus. So that is the best news we've had for a long time from Europe. On other points, there are also some other places where Europe has started to find solutions and has started some good ideas, especially on corporate transparency. We have a law that for banks, they should actually publish numbers showing where they do business and how much they pay in tax in each country where they're present. We haven't quite had the political will to expand this to all corporations, but it's good to see that it can be done, and this is public information. So that's a very important example to follow and to include in the global negotiations. And lastly, the Europeans do also have some examples of automatic information exchange between countries. And what that means is that tax administrations send information to each other about which citizens from other countries have bank accounts in this country. And by exchanging that information, it means that the tax administration actually receives the information that they need to make sure that citizens from their country pay the taxes that they should. But the Europeans have this system internally for themselves. And as long as it's not at the global level, obviously there are still many places where wealth can be hidden. So the last thing I want to say is that it goes for the Europeans as well as for all other countries, is that no country can solve this alone. The Europeans are dependent on a truly global tax cooperation to make sure that tax systems become efficient and therefore also can become progressive. But of course, it's not just good news for Europe that the Europeans have said yes to global corporations, to global cooperation at the United Nations. It really is fantastic news for everyone. And we have a proposal for a UN tax convention that was launched last year by the Global Alliance and the Eurodad. And it shows that there's so much good stuff that can be done in a truly global tax cooperation forum. So much more exciting stuff to come. Thank you so much, Nana and everyone.
Thank you, Tove. As you had mentioned, we truly are in an exciting time. It feels like a watershed moment for international tax cooperation now that we have this resolution. And as you had mentioned, I mean, we cannot talk about women's equality and wealth taxation in a vacuum, in a regional or country-specific vacuum when financial secrecy is so international. So thank you again for those really, really astute remarks. Now I will pass over the floor to Sofia, who will give us some perspective about what's happening across the United States.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. I'm going to start off by just saying gender-based tax inequality has become a pivotal issue facing our society today. Amongst the various ways in which it manifests today, I'll be addressing IRS audit rates in the US, the burden on women for corporate tax avoidance, corporate secrecy, and US policy efforts. Women are more likely than men to get audited by the IRS due to funding cuts that the IRS faces. Audit rates are much higher for people who fall under the single earning tax credit, who have an annual income below $20,000. On the other hand, when the IRS detects the most obvious forms of non-tax compliance amongst the wealthy, it is stretched too thin to follow up adequately. A Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration report published last year found that the IRS had failed to follow up with more than 369,000 high-income households that simply did not file a tax return in the previous years. This is evidence that many women have lower incomes, higher unpaid tax burdens, and fewer assets, leaving them vulnerable to higher IRS audit rates. Such underlying differences between men and women in their employment and economic activities have important tax implications. Secondly, women experiencing poverty or owning small businesses do not have access to the profit shifting and tax dodging practices of large multinational corporations. This leaves them disadvantaged and discriminated against in the US tax system. Along this issue, when the multinational corporations profit shift and avoid taxes, the tax gap burden is then picked up by taxpayers, proportionally women, since they are less likely to have as many tax breaks as men. New research suggests that 40% of multinational profits are shifted to tax havens, and that 10% of the world's largest multinational firms are responsible for 98% of this activity. The result is $200 billion in lost global tax revenue. Possible solutions to this issue could be a globally agreed 15% minimum corporate tax rate, such as OECD resolution. Kleptocratic money laundering schemes fuel inequality as politicians and senior government officials steal from international aid and government funds that should go towards social and gender equality programs in their own respective countries. They then stash their illegally gotten gains in real estate or shell companies. The US has become a gateway for this type of money laundering because there is not a beneficial ownership requirement for non-corporate service providers, making it possible for US enablers to facilitate money laundering with ease. Another issue strictly beyond the tax code is corporate secrecy. The US is the easiest place to set up an anonymous shell company. This impacts women as some of the sources of illicit financial flows facilitated by anonymous shell companies, such as sex and human trafficking, affect men and women differently. There are also aid in tax avoidance, reducing resources for gender-just investments. There can be many challenges facing our efforts, one of which was passing the Enablers Act, a major anti-money laundering bill that would extend the Bank Secrecies Act definition of financial institution to lawyers and other non-bank commercial service providers, holding them to the same know your customer checks and other regulations banks have on money laundering. This bill passed in the House of Representatives, but fell short in the Senate. Another US policy difficulty has been the full and fair implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act, also known as the CTA. There has a proposed form that companies would use to file beneficial ownership information that has a loophole that would enable people to continue to hide their true identities by stating that they couldn't find the information required, undermining the CTA entirely, as well as lawsuits in opposition against implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act. We are also fighting to ensure that the Corporate Transparency's second proposed rule has proper access and that foreign law enforcement agencies have easy access to pursue transnational money laundering investigations and tax evasion. As we continue to fight towards fair implementation, we have enjoyed White House support and bipartisan congressional support signaling the importance of this issue in our country. With the second U.S. Summit for Democracy at the end of this month, we are hoping for further action by the Biden administration to address illicit finance and money laundering, including the possible announcement of the first ever proposed Treasury Department regulation to tackle real estate money laundering.
All right, Sofia, thank you so much for that excellent overview. As you had mentioned, the Corporate Transparency Act in the US is definitely a very welcome first step, but it is just a first step. I mean, especially in light of the unequal audit rates, IRS audit rates that you had mentioned, that is absolutely an issue that will need to be resolved very, very quickly. So with that, Sofia and Tove, really, really grateful for your remarks today. To close out your session, I just want to give you each a minute or two to provide some closing remarks and also share any information that you may have on how individuals can really mobilize and support this work in the US and also in Europe. So with Tove, I'll hand over the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Nana. Yeah, the first thing to say on the links between tax and gender equality, and also going back to Aurea's point in the beginning, is that these are no longer options. These are must, and that includes wealth taxation, because it has become so unequal that we cannot resolve the inequality challenges without having effective wealth taxation. In the proposal for a UN tax convention that we have launched, we've also pointed to the fact that the international community has already committed to gender equality. It's already reflected in numerous objectives and conventions at the United Nations. And by having a UN tax negotiation in the same house as the house where governments committed to the Sustainable Development Goals and to creating gender equality, we can start linking the international policy making on tax to the international goals on these issues. And that's reflected in the proposal for a UN tax convention. Of course, the same link needs to happen at the national level. And that goes to my second point in terms of what people can do. As Âurea also said, we have been running these days of action on tax and gender. It's the 7th edition. And when we started, it was a bit of a niche debate, and we even had questions on how are these things linked. I think we've come such a long way, and this issue of tax and gender and the links between gender inequality and our broken tax systems, it's become so much more mainstream. And we see it coming up in the European Parliament. We see international institutions that are launching publications on this, which is a soft start, because of course we need to see politicians walk the talk and actually repair the tax systems in line with the demands that we're calling for. But what people can do is engage in these days of actions. And one of the cool things about the Global Alliance is that it's really a global alliance of organizations all around the world that are pushing this issue for the next 2 weeks, very much on social media, but also through events and by joining and by spreading the word and by pushing the campaigns. I don't think that we can only say that people could have a great impact. We can actually say we've already had. This issue is getting so much more attention than when we started 7 years ago. So to everyone, I would just say, keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Tove. And now, Sofia, I will hand over the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Gender-based tax inequality must be addressed and fought for. Today, I talked about addressing IRS audit rates, the burden on women from corporate tax avoidance, corporate secrecy, and US policy efforts. The FACT Coalition is committed to continuing to work on tax and gender justice issues, and are thankful for the opportunity to speak at the GDOA Tax Justice for Women's Rights 2023 launch event. And I completely agree with Tove's point on engagement. I think that the more engagement that this topic receives, the more it'll be addressed. And we've done such a great job at already promoting this over the past decade. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having us.
I have to say, I think the pleasure is all ours for having you, Sofia. Thank you as well for your closing remarks. Now, actually, we have a delightful surprise. We have Erica Beauchesne with us here. She is communications coordinator at Canadians for Tax Fairness, and she is going to offer a few remarks before I pass over the baton to Âurea and we close the event. So Erica, I will give you the floor now.
Thank you. I won't be able to do as great of a job as Katrina Villa would, but I'm happy to speak on behalf of the C4TF as the communications coordinator. I think, like many of the great remarks that have been shared already this morning, the need for tax justice for women's rights is greater than ever. We've seen coming out of the pandemic how women have been disproportionately affected economically, and our tax system needs to recognize that with the right measures to recover revenue and invest in programs and services that benefit women. Here in Canada, one of the things that we've really been focused on is recovering lost revenue from corporate tax avoidance. And we've done we've put out a number of reports this year highlighting how much Canada has lost to large profitable corporations that have seen great gains in recent years, and yet not contributed anywhere close to their fair share in taxes. One report that we did found that in 2021 alone, 123 of Canada's biggest corporations avoided 30 billion in taxes. And in terms of trying to wrap your head around 30 billion and how much that is, 30 billion is actually enough to have reduced the federal and provincial deficit in 2021 by 20% in Canada. So that's an incredible amount of money that could be used to strengthen funding for women, strengthen programs that benefit women, that benefit everybody throughout the economy, such as healthcare, accessible childcare, education, affordable housing. Housing is another thing here in Canada that is becoming increasingly unaffordable, along with food prices, and that's really affecting those who are already struggling, and really affecting women as well. So we've been trying to highlight how the government can make corporations pay their fair share by closing tax loopholes for corporations and the wealthy, by cracking down on the use of tax havens. We know that Canadian corporate use of tax havens continues. Another report that we released this year showed that many large Canadian corporations, while avoiding billions in taxes, also took pandemic subsidies at the same time. So they were not only avoiding contributing their fair share, but they were taking government money that could be used to fund public services for Canadians, and they took those subsidies and actually reduced employment and continued to pay out shareholders. So this transfer of wealth from large corporations to the richest members of society continued even while people were losing jobs, even while families were struggling with higher food costs. And so we really, really need to highlight just how much our tax system, while it is supposed to be addressing equality, is actually contributing to inequality. And that's where we've had a lot of focus as an organization this past year, and advocating for reforms, progressive reforms to the tax system to make it fairer and to make sure that many of these big corporations are contributing.
Erica, thank you so much for that really important overview as to how corporate taxation plays a really important role and really needs to be discussed if we're talking about reducing gender inequality through taxation. So again, I just want to thank all of our esteemed panelists for such an illuminating conversation. I know we only had about an hour together, but they were able to discuss these issues so in depth. And I hope that all of our participants walk away with a greater understanding of how taxation and gender equality intersect and some actions that they can take on the ground in their own countries. So with that, I'm going to pass over the baton to Âurea to offer some closing remarks as we embark on this campaign.
Thank you, Nana. Thank you, Erica, Tove, Sofia, Jeannie, Verónica, and Chenai. It's always really great to hear you because it underscores not only the importance of understanding the local context of each country, each region, but also what unites us and why is it important to bring us all together as the feminist women fighting for economic justice and tax justice to underscore and fight together for this that is really a really global and common struggle. I don't want to belabor this, but Grace has been very gracefully providing links on the chat that you can access. But I want to say that two things. One, this campaign is really an effort of not just GATJ, but and its regional members, but it's an effort of the Tax and Gender Working Group. There are many more organizations that have made this campaign possible, and I want to thank all of them. There are too many to mention, but I want to thank all of them for this effort. And I want to invite all of you to engage with the campaign that has events that many of which are going to be hosted by not only member organizations of the Tax and Gender Working Group, but also other organizations. In the order of, we have about 30 events now, ranging from social media actions to panels to sharing sessions where reports will be sharing. So we'll have a very rich 2 weeks ahead of us. Not incidentally, a very rich 2 weeks because this 2 weeks also are the 2 weeks of the CSW. This campaign traditionally runs along CSW. So we're going to be engaging in these conversations more deeply with other partners along the 2 weeks. I want to say and highlight some of the key actions that we're going to have at the global level for GATJ. The first, apart from this, today at 8:30 CET, 2:30 Eastern Standard Time, we're going to have a parallel event at the UNCSW on digital frontiers for feminist tax justice, where we're going to be highlighting what are the challenges of digitalization of the economy and digitalization of tax administrations on the feminist tax justice agenda. So I invite you all, if you cannot be in presence, to follow us online. The links for registration are on our social medias and also being shared on the chat. We're going to have on the 8th of March, International Women's Day, a photo action that is going to follow suit from the efforts that our colleagues in TAFJA, the Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia network, have been doing for many years on the 8 for 8 campaign. We're inviting all of you to share your photos and maybe reflections on why it is important to connect or reflect on tax justice as we commemorate International Women's Days. So follow GATJ, but specifically follow TAFJA and tell us about your actions as well, or rather show us. We're also going to have on the 15th of March, another Twitter action, this time where we're going to be posing some questions to a broader global audience, all of you, where we're going to be wanting to hear your answers. We have provided a toolkit for this campaign, and the toolkit includes also guidelines for this Twitter action. So please check it out through the links that have been provided in the chat. And finally, on the 17th of March, the last day of the campaign, we're going to have a final gathering to reflect not only on the achievements on the campaign, but how do we take the struggle forward beyond these 2 weeks? As it's been underscored by all the introductions, all the presentations that were made here, this is not something that countries can do alone. This is not something that can can be done in a short time. So there's an urgency in continue underscoring and demanding for the introduction of wealth taxes beyond this moment. So I'm inviting all of you to come and reflect collectively on in which direction do we take this demand for wealth taxes. Other than that, I really want to finally invite you to please read the concept note. We have outlined all of the demands that we are making for this campaign in terms of the different target audiences. These are demands that you can lift and use to advocate in your regions, in your countries, even at the global level, if you wish, and also comment. So this is work in progress. Tove has said, I just joined GATJ, but I know of GATJ's work and GATJ and allies work for many years. So the fact that I'm here and I'm able to articulate this is also a testament to how important this work is, not only to conscientize politicians and decision makers, but other women on the importance of bringing to the fore the connections between tax and gender from a feminist perspective. Nana, finally, I want to thank you for carrying us through this launch. You've been a pleasure to witness here, and thank you for holding the space for us. I want to again thank all of you for joining us in this morning, afternoon, and evening, and invite you again to carry along with us during these 2 weeks. Over to you, Nana.
Âurea, thank you so much for those really robust closing remarks. Again, I thank our esteemed panelists and all of our participants for watching today, and hope that you leave feeling inspired and mobilized to take some action in your home countries. And with that, I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.